Welcome to today's lesson on conflicts over international boundaries, where we'll explore the complex issues that arise when countries dispute the lines that separate them. International boundaries are not just lines on a map. They represent sovereignty, control over resources, and national identity. When these borders are in dispute, tensions can rise, leading to conflicts that affect not only the countries involved, but also regional and global stability. In this screencast, we're going to look at real-world examples of boundary conflicts, the underlying causes, and how they can escalate into larger geopolitical issues. We'll also examine the role of international organizations in attempting to resolve these disputes. Let's dive in. Boundaries play a crucial role in defining the extent of a country's control over its territory. They can be defined, delimited, demarcated, and administered. The definition of a boundary refers to the legal description or agreement that establishes where a boundary lies, often based on treaties or international agreements. Delimitation refers to the drawing of a boundary on a map, setting the lines clearly. Demarcation involves physically marking the boundary on the ground, using fences, walls, or other markers to show the boundary in real-world space. Lastly, administration refers to the enforcement and management of the boundary, including border patrols and regulations. These boundaries can exist on both land and water, with countries often having boundaries that extend into oceans, rivers, or lakes. Boundaries are not just geographical, they are a powerful expression of political power and territoriality. By establishing boundaries, countries assert their sovereignty, their authority over a specific area. However, boundaries are not fixed. They are subject to change through treaties, wars, or negotiations, and can sometimes lead to conflicts when countries disagree about where one boundary should be placed. In many cases, boundaries can also reflect cultural or economic divisions within a country or between neighboring countries. For example, a boundary might be drawn along a river that serves as both a natural feature and a dividing line between two culturally distinct regions. Similarly, boundaries may divide areas with different economic activities, like agricultural land and urban centers, which can lead to different ways of using and managing land on either side. These divisions highlight the role of boundaries in not just separating nations, but also shaping the cultures, economies, and conflicts within them. Boundaries are essential in defining the space that a country controls and governs. There are four main steps in how boundaries are identified: defined, delimited, demarcated, and administered. First, boundaries are defined through legal agreements or treaties between countries. This is the process in which countries agree on the specific location of their borders, often negotiated and set down in formal documents. These definitions are the foundation of international relations and territorial sovereignty. Once a boundary is defined, the next step is to delimit it. This means identifying the location of the boundary on a map. The delimitation process usually happens at the same time as the definition and is done through legal designations, marking the boundary line in a way that everyone can understand and recognize on a map. The third step in identifying boundaries is demarcation, where visible markers are placed on the landscape. These could be physical objects like fences, walls, or signs that clearly show where one country ends and another begins. Demarcation ensures that there is no ambiguity on the ground about where the boundary is located, making it visible to the people living near it. Lastly, boundaries are administered, which refers to how the border is legally managed and regulated. This includes the enforcement of laws, the control of immigration, the regulation of trade, and the prosecution of any illegal activities that take place at the border. Administering a boundary ensures that a country can maintain its sovereignty and control over the land within its borders. Together, these steps, defining, delimiting, demarcating, and administering, help ensure that boundaries are clear, respected, and managed properly, allowing countries to exercise control over their territory. Maritime boundaries are incredibly important for a variety of reasons, especially when it comes to a country's economy, security, and resources. One of the main reasons maritime boundaries matter is for trade and shipping routes. Oceans and seas serve as vital highways for international trade, allowing goods to be transported between countries. Control over maritime boundaries means having access to these key routes, which are essential for global commerce. Another key issue to maritime boundaries is fishing rights. Oceans provide a significant source of food, and control over marine areas allows countries to regulate fishing in their waters. This ensures sustainable practices and prevents overfishing, which can deplete fish populations and harm local economies. Without clear maritime boundaries, disputes over fishing territories can arise, affecting the livelihoods of local communities and industries. Oil reserves found beneath the ocean floor also make maritime boundaries crucial. Many countries depend on offshore oil and gas reserves for energy and economic development. Control over maritime zones allow countries to tap into these resources, which can be a significant source of revenue. Disputes over boundaries in regions rich in natural resources can lead to conflicts as countries seek to claim their share of these valuable reserves. Maritime boundaries are also important for defense and national security. A nation's ability to protect its coastline and offshore territories is vital for defensive purposes. Control over surrounding waters allows for better monitoring of naval traffic, preventing unauthorized access to a country's waters. This is especially important in regions where military activity or potential threats exist. Lastly, landlocked countries face significant disadvantages due to their lack of direct access to the sea. Without maritime boundaries, these countries are unable to establish trade routes by sea, making them reliant on neighboring countries for access to ports and shipping lanes. This geographic disadvantage can hinder their economic development and limit their ability to engage in global trade. Like land boundaries, maritime boundaries are highly disputed and subject to conflict. Countries often contest their maritime zones, especially in areas where resources, trade routes, or strategic locations are at stake. As a result, maritime boundaries are a critical aspect of international relations and often require careful negotiation and cooperation to resolve conflicts and ensure peaceful coexistence between nations. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, established in 1982, is a key international agreement that governs the rights and responsibilities of nations with respect to their use of the world's oceans. One of the primary aspects of this convention is the concept of the territorial sea, which extends 12 nautical miles from a country's coastline. Within this zone, a nation has complete sovereignty over the water and the airspace above it, meaning that the country has full control over all activities, such as fishing, shipping, military operations, everything in this area. However, while a country has sovereignty over its territorial sea, the UNCLOS also allows for the innocent passage of foreign ships. This means that ships from other nations are allowed to pass through a country's territorial waters as long as they're not engaging in activities that could be considered harmful or threatening to the security or peace of a coastal state. For example, foreign ships can transit through territorial seas for navigation or transport purposes, but they must not engage in activities such as spying, military maneuvers, or pollution. The idea of innocent passage balances a country's control over its territorial waters with the need for global maritime navigation. The Convention provides a legal framework for resolving disputes over the use of the seas, ensuring that countries can benefit from maritime resources and shipping lanes while respecting each other's sovereignty and rights. The Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, as defined by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982, extends 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline. Within this zone, a nation has special rights to the exploration and use of marine resources, which includes activities like fishing, whaling, and the extraction of natural resources such as oil, natural gas, and renewable energy sources like wind and wave energy. While the territorial sea gives a country complete control over its waters up to 12 nautical miles from shore, the EEZ offers a different kind of sovereignty. In the EEZ, the coastal state has exclusive rights to exploit the resources, but it does not have full sovereignty over the waters themselves. Other countries may still use the EEZ for activities like navigation, overflight, and laying undersea cables, but they must do so in accordance with the laws and regulations set by the coastal state, especially when it comes to economic and environmental matters. The creation of the EEZ has greatly expanded the potential for countries to benefit from oceanic resources, which can be a major driver of economic growth, especially for nations with rich marine environments. However, disputes often arise over the boundaries of EEZs, particularly in areas where maritime zones of two or more countries overlap, requiring international cooperation and conflict resolution to manage these valuable resources effectively. When exclusive economic zones are less than 400 nautical miles apart, the boundary between them can become a point of dispute between neighboring countries. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, each coastal state has special rights over the exploration of marine resources within its EEZ, but when the zones of two countries are so close to each other, it becomes necessary to negotiate and agree on a clearly defined boundary. In such cases, the countries involved must work together to establish a boundary that is equitable and fair. Typically, this is done through bilateral agreements or international arbitration, which might involve technical solutions based on geographic features, such as midline boundaries. A midline boundary means that the EEZs are divided along a line that is equidistant from the two countries' coastlines. However, it's not always as straightforward as that, and many factors such as historical claims, geographic features, and economic interests come into play when deciding the exact boundary. For example, when two countries have EEZs that overlap by less than 400 nautical miles, it often leads to negotiations over shared resources like fishing grounds or undersea oil deposits. These negotiations are crucial because the marine resources within this zone can be very valuable, and conflicts may arise over who gets access to them. Ultimately, when EEZs are in such close proximity, cooperation and diplomacy are key. The countries involved may need to go to international courts or seek third-party mediation to find an equitable solution to avoid potential conflicts and ensure that the marine environment is protected for future generations. The median line principle is an important concept in determining the boundary between exclusive economic zones when two or more countries are in close proximity to each other. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, when the EEZs of two countries overlap and the distance between their coasts is less than 400 nautical miles, the boundary is often drawn using the median line method. This principle involves drawing a boundary that is exactly midway between the coasts of the neighboring countries. Essentially, it divides the overlapping marine area into two equal parts, ensuring that both nations have an equal claim to resources in that area. This method is seen as fair because it provides an equitable solution to disputes over access to marine resources like fishing grounds, oil reserves, or natural gas deposits. For example, if two countries have coastlines that are relatively close, such as those bordering a narrow strait, the median line would be drawn halfway between the two coasts, creating a clear and balanced boundary. This boundary would then apply to the EEZs of both countries, allowing each to claim the resources within their designated zones. While the median line principle provides a clear and standardized method of resolving disputes, it's not always the final solution. In some cases, countries may still negotiate other terms based on historical claims, geological features, or economic considerations. Nonetheless, the median line serves as the fair starting point in determining maritime boundaries when countries are in close proximity to each other.